Okay. Hello, everybody at Briarwood. This is Leslie Reichert. I'm the Director of Life Enrichment, and I'm really excited. This is one of our very first virtual programs that we're doing with David Miller, and he's got a program called Beautiful Scottish Glens, and I'm going to let him get right to it. I'm going to get out of the way and let him take it from here. So welcome, David, and go right ahead and share with our viewers.
Thank you, Leslie. Greetings to all the good people in the Briarwood community. I'm glad that you can join me for this excursion to Scotland. And I want to give thanks to Bob Armstrong for inviting me to give this program. So here we go. You see my first slide, hiking in the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland, August 2018. Presented by myself, and you can email me for a written version of my narrative with more information if you like. Let's look at the pronunciation of Scottish place names. Look at this one. How would you pronounce the one at the top of the list? Now, how would you pronounce this second one? And how would you pronounce this third one, D-U-N-D-A-S? And how would you pronounce this one beginning with King? And how would you pronounce this familiar name? And how would you pronounce M-U-I-R? And how would you pronounce the D-H or the M-V, which are Gaelic? Well, the first one is Altan Jarek. The Scots Gaelic has a way of adding consonants where they're adding vowels where they're missing and subtracting consonants. And the names were a struggle to deal with. The second one, I would have said Coror, but it's Coror. And there's a street in Glasgow called the Dundas. And the town is Kingussie. And that other town is Perth, not Perth, as we would say. And we're familiar with the name of John Muir, but actually in Scotland it's pronounced Moore. And the combination DH is a silent symbol, and MH equals V. Don't ask me why the Scottish Gaelic acts like this, but that's how it is. So here we are with a map. We flew to Glasgow, and we took the train from Glasgow here up through Perth, up here to the Cairngorms National Park on the southwest side of Kingussie. And this map shows a little more detail. Glasgow here, Perth here, Pitlochry and Blair Athol is about here. That's where we started on our hiking in the Cairngorms National Park. The hikers are myself, age 76, Stuart Howe, age 65, Margot Stone, age 76, and Brad Stone, age 28. Photography by Miller, Howe, and Stone. And the map again, Glasgow at the bottom, Perth up here, and Blair Athol, the plains of Athol, where we landed our first night taking the train from Glasgow and spent an overnight in a lodging there before setting off on our hike. This is the train station in Blair Athol. We got off. The train service, the public transit is very good. And we went to the Athol Arms, the start and end of our trek. And I should say, you know, when we arrived in Glasgow, we took the airport shuttle downtown, and we had to do some grocery shopping because you can't bring certain kinds of foods into another country. And we had to get some fuel for our camp stoves, some butane canisters, because you can't take those on the plane. So we arrived at the Buchanan Street bus station, and we started walking and asked a passerby, how do we get over to Dundas Street? And he said, well, I'll walk with you over there. And he pointed out the Sainsbury's grocery store. And we went there and bought groceries, whatever we could get, a kind of opportunistic thing because they wouldn't necessarily have exactly what we wanted. And then we went to the Adventure One camping store to find canisters for our camp stoves. And then we went to the Queen Street railway station and caught the train north to Blair Athol, arriving here at the Athol Arms Hotel. And this is the dining room at the hotel. with kind of a hunting motif, lots of antlers around, and stuffed animals and birds. Now here we have a red fox. At his feet, a pheasant that he has apparently captured and will eat. And on the left side of the screen, a capercaillie, which is a very large grouse that inhabits the northern countries in Europe. That would be Scotland and the Scandinavia, etc. More shots of the interior of the dining room. And this is the room that Stuart and I had. Notice everything is a nice Scotch plaid here, including, we noticed as we came in, the rugs on the floor in the entryway. The little stuffed sheep on the vacant bed here has a purpose all its own. If you don't want to be disturbed, you put that outside the door while you're in the room. We started off the next day going up Glen Tilt, see Blair Athol at the bottom of the screen. Glen Tilt running up through, there's the Forest Lodge. And just beyond the Forest Lodge, we camped the first night around here. The second night, we continued on up the glen and then over into the watershed where Geldy Burn meets Spinack Burn, and we camped there for the second night. This is a typical British breakfast. We have here some mushrooms, some brown beans, an egg, a potato scone, a black pudding, which is a blood sausage, half a tomato, regular sausage, and some bacon, which looks like ham to us, but they call it bacon. A very fine breakfast, putting us in good form to engage in the strenuous activities of the coming day. And here is Stuart standing by a stand of fireweed, symbol of the northern country, and behind him is the gorge through which the River Tilt runs, and along which we will be hiking starting off this day. And we were glad to have a nice, warm, sunny day, because the weather in Scotland can be very wet and nasty and chilly a lot of the time. So we were glad to start off on a positive note. Notice the river on the right, and we're following this old estate path down through the gorge. Here we are going past a field with cattle in it. These roads were not public ways, and we did not see traffic on them. They're estate roads, and I don't know who uses them besides hikers, but not much traffic. There's the gang. There I am sitting on a bridge over the River Tilt, and there's the river down below. Here we are again, and there is the river down in the gorge. And notice this wonderful, huge old tree with the gnarly roots. Been there a long time. Now we're getting out of the forest and into the glen. Notice the hillsides with the red patches on them are where it's covered with heather, and the green patches are where there is pasture land. And there are a few trees along the way. We're following the two-track road. And we see sheep all over the landscape, and notice in the background a typical stone cottage. These cottages would have a fireplace on each end, a doorway in the middle, and a window on each side of the doorway. Typically there would be two large rooms inside, and it would be a shepherd's cabin for the shepherd and his family, or a gamekeeper's cottage, or something of that sort. Along the way, heading north. And there is heather all over the landscape in Scotland. Here is a close-up picture of it. Now, this is the forest by the Forest Lodge. Notice there are all mature trees. There's no undergrowth. The problem with this forest is that there are no seedlings to regenerate the forest. What happens is that the deer and the bunnies go through the forest, and any fresh leaves that sprout from the ground, they will nip them off and eat them, and therefore the forest, long term, will be dying unless something is done to save it. And when we went into the gate at the Forest Lodge, there was a sign that said, "Please don't harass the deer. You'll scare them off their best habitat, and they will they will be, it'll damage their health. It's healthier for the deer if you allow us to chase them down in the fall and shoot them, and bring home the hunter's prey. Go figure. Here we are at our first camp alongside the road. The river is down deep in the valley, and we're camped on this 6-foot wide berm between the road and the river valley. It was a windy day, and that was blowing the midges away, so they weren't bothering us. But the wind was fierce, and the tents were flapping, and we were concerned whether the tents would blow down in the night. The wind was so strong. And Stuart and I had these pyramidal tents, which shed the wind better, and Margos and Brad had these other tents that are kind of shaped like a sail, and the wind would get on the side of that and deform it rather radically. And we had a hard time getting to sleep with all the racket of the flapping and the blowing. And I heard Brad and Margos getting out of their tent in the darkness and spending a lot of time hammering the pegs in and resituating them. And at one point I heard Brad, apparently inside his tent, saying to his father on the outside, "Gee, what did you do? I think you made it worse." And somehow we got through the night. The next day, nobody took very many pictures. It was a cold, windy, wet day. And here we are going along the track now. No more road. Now it's a wilderness path. And we're approaching a river called Tarf Water. And what's the name of this bridge? The Bedford Bridge. And there's our first major waterfall. A lot of beautiful waterfalls in Scotland. Now here we are stopping for lunch amid the rain and the wind and the cold weather. It was so cold my hands were partly numb and my fingers were working in a rather clumsy fashion because of the effect of the weather on them. Now here we are. We had been told there would be a lot of fords over streams, and here is the ford at Geldy Burn. Most of them, fortunately, had been, it was late summer and it had been fairly dry, so most of them we could get over on stepping stones. But this one I just waded across. And I was hiking in Teva sandals because I figured, my feet are going to get wet from the rain and the fords across the burns. And hiking shoes and hiking boots don't dry out once they get wet, whereas the sandals with thin liner socks inside them will dry off a lot quicker. So I just waded across while the others, they wandered around looking for a crossing where they could get across on the stones. So here we are at the junction of Geldy Burn and Bynack Burn, putting up the tents, getting ready to spend the night. And there was this abandoned building, which had been first a shepherd's cottage for the shepherd and his family, and later a gamekeeper's cottage, and then was abandoned. And the sign says, "The National Trust for Scotland, caution, dangerous building." Well, suitably warmed, we nevertheless were quite happy to have this building and to avail ourselves of its shelter, putting the tents up outside. The inside was dirty and dusty, but there was a platform of 2 or 3 planks 10 inches off the floor on some stones where we could sort our gear and spread it out. And there were pegs on the wall where we could hang our wet rain gear and let it dry out. And we were sheltered partially from the wind and mostly from the rain in there. And I set up my kitchen in the window here, and Stuart set up his kitchen in the window there. And Brad and Margot set up their kitchen here, and we all were sorting our gear on the planks. This is my kitchen looking out over my tent. I should say a little bit about what we had to eat. My diet was like this. I had oatmeal in the morning, porridge, the Scottish would call it, with craisins and walnuts and 2 tablespoons of olive oil to give it a little more richness and sustain me through the cold weather. For lunch, I had a loaf of unsliced bread. Unsliced bread holds up well in the pack because the crust is stiff, and I can just bite off or cut off with my pocket knife a slice when I want to have lunch, whereas sliced bread loses its shape and gets all mashed up in the pack. I had some sausage and some peanut butter and some dried apricots to go with the bread. For supper, I had picked some rotini pasta at the Sainsbury's Market, some powdered spaghetti sauce, and also some chicken soup mix for an alternative. And again, more olive oil and some feta cheese with the pasta. And for snacks, I had some mixed nuts and some fruit and nut trail mix. So we had supper, pitched our tents, spent the night, got up in the morning, packed up, got ready to go. And some wise guy said, well, we should pose in the apertures of the cabin here and let that be our farewell picture. And by the way, there is a tradition of bothies, which are shelters for travelers, for hikers in the highlands. A bothy originated as a shepherd's shelter. Some of them are quite simple, quite rude, a stone hut, and later were abandoned and began to be used by hikers and campers. And the Mountain Bothies Association was organized to take over and maintain these bothies. And they have a project in order eventually to take this red house, so named for its red roof, and turn it into a bothy and upgrade it and secure it so that it'll be available for people like us and be a comfortable, safe lodging for the night. So we proceeded from this camp at Altown Jarrick toward Glendee and the Lerich Grew. Lerich is a word that means pass, and we don't know what Grew means. That was a pass between the portions of the mountain. So we started here where we camped overnight. We went up to the White Bridge and crossed over. Then we went up Glendee along the River Dee. We camped here at a bothy near the Devil's Point. The next day we proceeded north through the Lerich Grew to the Rothiemurchus Forest, where we planned to camp, and then into Aviemore, where we could resupply for the second half of our journey. So this is the landscape adjacent to the White Bridge. You'll notice again the dark patches are the heather, and the green patches are what are called sheilings. They're pastures for the animals. And here's the gang on the trail along the River Dee, and there's a sheep shed for sheltering sheep over on the side. This is the Chest of Dee, a beautiful waterfall. And notice there are some trees here on the face of the cliff. Most of the trees have either been cut away, used for firewood or timber, or the saplings have been eaten by the browsing animals. So you don't see a lot of trees in the highland usually, except in places like this, where the land is so rugged that it's too rugged for people and animals to get easy access. And a few trees survive in these rugged locations. The Chest of Dee again, 3 waterfall drops along the way, 1, 2, 3, and beautiful scenery from the edge. Now here we have Stuart standing next to a high fence alongside the River Dee. It was fencing in both sides of the River Dee here, and a big wide mesh here, and then a very narrow, like chicken wire mesh down here. And we weren't sure what this was all about, but we later learned that this was a reforestation project. The tall fence is to keep the deer out of the area, and the low fence is to keep the hares, the rabbit types, out of the area, so that the seedling trees, when they sprout, will not be browsed by these animals and killed before they can get growing. And there were large areas fenced along the river here where the reforestation project was going on. So here we are proceeding on up Glendee. The river is getting smaller as we approach the pass in the distance. That's David carrying his pack and looking at his map. You can see here the water coming down the cliff face on the left. This is a wide, sculptured U-shaped valley carved out by the glaciers a long time ago. And here is the kind of landscape, and you can see the rough trail on the right of the picture, and the clouds masking the peaks in the distance as we travel along. Very cloudy, damp, windy day again. We're approaching our campsite for the day at a peak called Bod and Devane, the Devil's Point. Well, really, what was the proper name for this? You know, the Victorian cartographers were worried that the name of this peak, if it were translated accurately, would be offensive to Queen Victoria, so they cleaned it up and called it the Devil's Point. Now, the landscape in the Highlands is littered here and there with peaks that have names including the word mam and pap, which indicate a breast or a nipple. And this is a reflection of an age-old obsession that the male people of the lands traveling the landscape have. Well, okay, the Devil's Point is a little different. What it really means is the Devil's Prick. And here it is, swathed in clouds. Imagine, you know, I can't see a prick in that. I don't know whether you can, but I don't know how they saw that, but they did. And obviously in their imagination, the devil was a mighty man. And this name, the Devil's Prick, for this peak indicates again a rather all too common obsession or preoccupation that males have with certain parts of the anatomy. We were planning to hike up to the top of the Devil's Prick to see the scenery, but it was swathed in clouds, so we gave up on the idea, thinking that we probably wouldn't see much from up there anyway. So here we are, our camp for the third night at Corroor Bothy, an old shepherd's shelter that has been maintained by the Mountain Bothies Association. Notice Stuart over here has his head net on to keep the midges off. The midges were swarming. And we went inside and spent the night. There was a young man from Ireland and a young woman from the Netherlands traveling there with him. And they had taken the space on the floor under one of the bunks. I elected to take a space on the floor by the far wall, and Stuart put up his tent outside. Margos and Brad took the upper bunk side by side, and then they found that they were tall enough that their head and feet were hitting, and it was not roomy enough for them. So Brad came down and took the space on the floor under the window, and then Margos could lie diagonally across the upper bunk and had space enough to rest for the night. So we slept on the floor, on the boards, whatever. This is the Bothy and its setting. It's a lovely setting. And beside the steps on the end of the building, there was a shovel. Many of the Bothys had a shovel. This was the equivalent of the flush toilet for the Bothy. You're supposed to take the shovel out in the landscape somewhere and dig a hole and make a deposit and cover it up neatly and then bring the shovel back. Or alternatively, oftentimes we would go out on the moor there and find a big flat rock and lift it up, make a deposit, and then drop the rock back on top of it. From there, we would proceed up through the Lerich Grue Pass toward Rothiemurchus Forest and town of Aviemore. Now, this is the Devil's Point in the morning, the Devil's Prick in the morning with Stuart's tent. Stuart went part way up the hill and took this picture coming back down. There's the Corroor Bothy. Here's where we came in the day before, up the valley, across the river to the Bothy. Now we have to go back across the river and then proceed on up the glen, following the River Dee toward the pass. And somebody asked me how high these peaks were. They're a little over 3,000 feet or a little over 1,000 meters high. So here we are proceeding up the pass toward the Lerich Grue. Notice that there are bluebells in Scotland as well as heather. And now the River Dee has dwindled away to just a rivulet, and the path has become steeper and more stony. This is a side channel with a hanging formation there. And now we are approaching all of these broken rocks which impede the way and make rather rough going. These pathways that we're hiking were historic pathways used from time immemorial by the inhabitants of the land. They were used by smugglers, by bandits, by cattle rustlers, by military patrols, by peddlers, by farmers going to market, and by women carrying baskets of egg to market. I have read that in the old days a smooth path was maintained through this so the cattle wouldn't break their legs, but the smooth path is no more. And this is the kind of stuff we were hiking over in a gentle rain. And we stopped for lunch. Having our knife out to slice off some of my bread, I better not drop it in these rocks or drop anything else because I'll never get it back. And behind us is one of the pools of Dee. These are the sources of the River Dee, and the river will cease to flow up above these, and we'll go on beyond it and down the other side. So here we are again, going up past one of the little pools of Dee. Maybe we've started down the other side here, I'm not sure. This is the other side, and in the background, we have the Rothiemurchus forest, and behind it, the town of Aviemore, which we will get to eventually, going down through the glen. This is the kind of scenery we were encountering. And now we're going down steeply into the next valley. And here you see the path coming over the mountain, down through here, and crossing a brook. And notice the brook emerges out of these broken rocks. This brook did that several times off and on. It would emerge out of the broken rocks, disappear under the rocks, emerge out of the rocks, disappear under the rocks again, and it went on down the mountain until it became a brook running without hiding under the rocks any longer. Here we have a series of slides showing some of the wild berries that grow in the Arctic and subarctic regions of the Northern Hemisphere, Asia, Europe, and North America. These are bearberries. These are all edible. These are crowberries, again edible. These are lingonberries, also known as mountain cranberries, and we saw blueberries as well, but I don't have a picture of them. So here we are. The path is getting a little smoother as we go down. And now we're entering into the Rothiemurchus forest and actually seeing a remnant of the ancient Caledonian forest that covered the land ages ago. And finally, we found a lovely campsite beside a brook to our relief, because we had hoped to camp at the edge of the forest, but the ground was so rough there, covered with heather and all bumpy and shrubbing, that we didn't know where we were going to camp, and there was no water nearby. So we were quite relieved when we got down to this valley and found a level place and a source of water, a place where we could spend the night and cook our dinner and relax. Here we are the next day, passing through the Rothiemurchus forest. Notice there are a lot of young trees here. This forest is regenerating. It is a healthy, lively forest, part of the reforestation effort that the Scottish National Trust is engaged in. And we're passing now through the flatlands. We've got back onto an old estate road, acres and acres of heather and some young trees getting started, acres and acres of heather. And here we are at the Loch an Eilean. Notice the whitecaps. The wind was kicking up whitecaps on the water. There's a small island over here with a remains of a castle on it, but we couldn't really see much. So we were disappointed about that. And this is Milton Cottage nearby. I was excited, thinking maybe John Milton had something to do with this cottage, but my research indicates nothing of the case. The cottage is located near a brook called Milton Brook. And in truth, in the olden times, the towns in the United Kingdom needed, each one that had any substantial population, needed a mill. And so there were mills all over the land so that people could grind their grain and make bread. And several of the mills gave their names to towns named Milltown. And this Milton Cottage is a remnant of that. And John Milton's name would have been a reflection of some association that he had with a mill town. here we have a pillar commemorating the life of James Martineau, who lived in the 19th century. He was a Unitarian minister, educator, scholar, and philosopher who loved this area and on retirement made his home here. He was very well known in Europe and received honorary doctoral degrees from several European universities and from one or two here in the States. This is a monument commemorating the memory of James Martineau, who lived in the 19th century. He was a Unitarian minister and educator, a scholar and philosopher who loved this area and on retirement made his home here. And he was very famous in his day throughout Europe, received honorary doctoral degrees from several European universities and from one or two in this country. And here is the Glenmore Lodge, a former hunting lodge, now a youth hostel. After we went into Aviemore and restocked our groceries and bought fuel canisters and had a nice meal in a restaurant, we took the bus over here and we spent the night in this place. This is like one of the rooms that we had. We arrived early, about 3 o'clock, and we're told we couldn't check in until 5 o'clock, so we had to cool our heels. We were required to take off our shoes so we wouldn't track mud from the moors into the building. And I wandered around looking for things and locating the facilities. I met a chambermaid who said, well, since you're signed up for the night, I can give you a towel and you can take a shower. So I showered. I put on my rain pants so that I could wash my underwear and my trousers and dry them in the drying room, in the dryer first, then in the drying room. And many of these establishments have a drying room. It's a room with steam pipes to hang your wet clothes and your wet tents on. It's hot and very humid, and given the weather, you know, it's a good facility to have when you hit one of these places overnight. Here's the dining room at the hostel, and here again is that wonderful breakfast from the United Kingdom with all the filling, nourishing materials that go into it. From Glenmore to the Fords of Avon via the Lerich on Louis. Lerich is a pass, and Louis refers to the calf that, I don't know why it's named after the calf, but apparently cattle were driven over the pass. So here's Aviemore. We took the bus over here to Glenmore Lodge, and then we followed the trail up around here and over and down to the River Avon. Here's a better map. Glenmore Lodge, the path up through the Loch an Uain, around past Bynach Beck and Bynach Moor. By the way, Bynach Moor, Moor means big, Beck means small. Two peaks named Bynach Beck and Bynach Moor. And we went on down here to the Fords of Avon, where we were to spend the night. And this is the Loch an Uain. Loch an is a little loch or a small lake. Uain means green. And there are several Loch an Uains on the topo maps that we had of the area. They have a greenish color to the water. And the question is, why do they have this greenish color? Well, the folklore is that this is where the fairies wash their clothes, and hence green. More likely answer is that it has something to do with the algae growing in the water, or with the glacial minerals that are ground out of the rocks by the glaciers as they pass. Here is the Loch an Uain again, a beautiful little lake in the highlands. And here we are on the road heading south now out of Glenmore. We noticed as we walked along, we saw ahead of us a reindeer, and we saw the tracks on the road, and we thought, well, it would be nice if we could, you know, catch up to these reindeer and get a better view of them, but they seem to be a little skittish. So we continued along the way down towards Strathnethy, which is the valley of the River Nethy. And lo and behold, there we saw the reindeer. There's one by the bridge. There's one chewing on a tree. A little better view, a reindeer here, reindeer here, reindeer there. And here we are again, reindeer, 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 reindeer. There were 5 of them by the Strathnethy Bridge. Another view of the River Nethy and the reindeer. And here's a view we saw later on as we were passing over the valley. Dappled clouds and little water pools in the distance. This was a very windy day. For the next 3 days, we had a lot of wind. And I had discovered the second day as we were going up the Glen Tilt that I was stumbling on those rocky paths and wondering, am I losing my sense of balance or what? Well, later it dawned on me we were being buffeted by the wind, and there was just enough wind buffeting that you would aim your foot for a place between the rocks, and the wind would knock you sideways a half an inch or an inch, and you'd miss your footing. So I was, relieved to think that probably it was the wind buffeting us that was causing me to be so clumsy. Now this is the plateau of the Lerich an Luie. You'll notice here no trees, and the heather is very short. The climate is so extreme up here that things only grow 5 or 6 inches high. And it was cold, and we stopped for lunch here, and I got out all my warm clothing and put it on, and we got down in a little hollow beside the trail to eat our lunch and keep warm until we got back on the walk and began warming up from the exercise again. Now that's Stuart standing in the plateau in the pass. Here we are going down the other side, heading south toward the Fords of Avon. That is a rock formation on top of Bynack Beck. And this is more of the valley that we were passing through. We met 2 English youth, a brother and a sister, 16 and 21 years old, the sister being the 21-year-old. And I thought how wonderful that they have the kind of relationship that they can enjoy this type of experience together. And I complimented them on that. We met hikers of many nationalities on the trail. Of course, some were Scottish, some were English, some were Irish, some were Dutch, some were French, some were German, some were Belgian, some were Swedish, some were Polish, and of course we were Americans. People come from all over to enjoy the Scottish Highlands. And here we are at the Fords of Avon. We saw this rainbow arching over the hill to the east. And this is just in the evening, dinner time. Just before we went to bed, we saw a herd of 20 reindeer ranging over the hill there under where the rainbow is now. And we had met 4 reindeer rangers who were on a hike for the day. And they told us that the reindeer were originally indigenous animals here, although they were never really wild. They were semi-tame. And they have been reintroduced, and they are allowed to range over the landscape, as we saw them doing. And here is the shelter at the Fords of Avon. Notice it's not very big, not very tall. Inside, if you stood in the very center of the building, you could stand up without hitting your head, but the rafters would have been in front of your eyes, and we kept bumping our heads as we moved around. There was room for 2 people with a little to spare. 3 people would be crowded and 4 people would be ultra crowded. So Brad and Margos decided to sleep outside, and Stuart and I slept inside. Notice the rocks all around the shelter. There's Stuart climbing the shelter. You may wonder why there are so many rocks piled up around this shelter in a pyramid. Well, it's to keep it from blowing away like a tumbleweed in the storms. The winds up here several times a year get up to 100 miles an hour. And, if they weren't anchored well, it would go tumbling head over heels across the tundra. This is the view looking out from the shelter into the landscape. This was the only way to let air and light in, and I was concerned whether we were going to have to close this up at night to keep it secure, and I didn't like the idea of being closed up in there, but I was afraid of the midges, which are little no-see-em-like critters that are all over the tundra, all over the moor. It turned out, however, that the midges are like the black flies in the North American continent. They don't like to be in enclosed places. So if you get them in your tent, they will congregate on the screen opening out toward the light. And as a matter of fact, they would not come inside the doorway. They would hover around outside the doorway, but they stayed outside the shelter so that we were able to leave the door open, let the fresh air and the light in during the night and the evening and the morning. This is Brad washing the dishes. We came indoors to cook to get away from the midges. Oh, and notice the poster on the wall that tells you how to use the shovel and how to go out in the moor and dig a hole and leave a deposit. This is the ford over the River Avon with the bothy, the shelter at the Fords of Avon on the opposite side. We were a little concerned whether people would get wet feet doing this, but they all made it across safely, picking their way carefully over the rocks. From the Fords of Avon, we went down to Glengeldy and Glenderry and across the Glen Louis to the Linn of Dee and once more to the White Bridge. Here is the Fords of Avon. Here we are going down Derry Burn. Here is Louis Water and Glen Louis. Here is the Linn of Dee, and we were expecting to camp here, but again we ran up against the problem of the forest having rough floors and not good places to camp. So we continued on down the River Dee, another 7 kilometers to the junction of Geldy Burn and Bynack Burn to the Red House, and we camped there again for another night. So this is the view down the glen as we headed south. And here we stopped at the junction of Louis Water and Glenderry, Derry Burn, to have lunch. And we ran into this ranger working for the National Trust. He's surveying and evaluating a reforestation project. He explained to us about the reforestation fence we saw and the problem with the deer and the bunnies. And he told us we're shooting as many deer as we can to protect the forest because we have way too many deer. And here is the view down the valley. Again, you can see the forest is beginning to regenerate in this area. There are some older, more mature forests on the other side of the glen. Nice view of the fireweed, one of my favorite northern plants. And here we are at the Linn of Dee. A linn is a pool or a cascade of this sort. You can see there's a bridge taking the road over it. It's about 30 feet high, and the water plunges down through. The pictures really don't do it justice. You can see how it's carved through the rock. And here is the view above the Linn. This word Linn is a Gaelic word that occurs also in the name of Dublin in Ireland. Dublin means black pool. Duv is black and Linn is pool, and there's a dark pool in the river at Duv Linn there in Dublin, which gave the city its name. So we went on down Glengeldy and to Glenfeshie. Here's the Linn of Dee. Here's where we camped. Then we went up Glengeldy, up Glengeldy Burn. We crossed over the height of land and started down Glenfeshie over here to Auchlean. Camping once here, camping again over here in Glenfeshie, and then thinking about camping at Auchlean the following day. This is the rainbow that we saw in the morning at the Red House. Here we are packing up inside. Notice there was a fireplace in this far wall of the building, but part of it, the wall is peeled away and dropped on the ground, and the wall is bulging several inches out of plumb and needs to be shored up to make the place safe once again. Here we saw a bicyclist. There were lots of bicyclists running around the landscape, and he is walking because he has a headwind. We're going to have a headwind all day long. Our third day in a row of dealing with these strong winds. It was so strong that at times we had to push against it as we walked to make headway. It wasn't just, walking along easily. We had to exert ourselves to push against the wind resistance. And that's why this man is pushing his bicycle. We had a beautiful sunny day for a change as we went up Glengeldy. And here we saw a reforestation project, Pearls in Peril, Geldy 6 Woodland Creation, sponsored by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, Europe investing in rural areas. Now that we've had the Brexit the United Kingdom will not be getting this kind of help from the European Union any longer. Here is the reforestation project. These wooden stakes to hold the saplings upright and a plastic collar to protect them. Most of them didn't have any foliage coming out of the top. We don't know whether the bunnies and the deer ate the tops off and they died or what was happening. We don't know how successful this reforestation project will be. Here is David leaning against the wind and studying his map as we cross over the headland, the height of land from Glen Geldy into Glen Feshie. Now we're looking down into Glen Feshie now. And here we have a bridge across the River Adart. We came up this way to the bridge and came across. There's kind of a canyon here. And the sign at the head of the bridge said, "Dangerous bridge, caution, cross at your own risk." Well, there's no other way to get across. And it seems safe enough. So we walked across and we stopped for snacks on the other side. Stuart and Brad were waiting for us here. They, being the younger two in our group, often could get ahead of Margos and myself. So I told them, when you come to a river with a bridge across it, stop and wait for us there. And we caught up with them at the River Adart. Here is Brad doing the Macho Man pose on the precipice on the edge of the river. Here is looking upstream from the bridge. And here is the bridge looking from downstream. And here's how the whole thing looked. There's Stuart packing up his gear and getting ready to pick up his pack. Magnificent sight. And here we are heading down Glen Feshie. And we came to this place where we came from here across the brook, and then we're going to go this way. And notice here there's a mountain goat. Well, the goat was spooked by us, but not real spooky. He just went up the hill a little bit where he thought we couldn't catch him and watched us as we made our U-turn and went away again. And there he is, magnificent animal. This is Glen Feshie. More heather, some more bluebells, some yellow, look like hawkweeds, beautiful flowers. And notice this gorgeous tree leaning on its branches in the tarn, partially uprooted on this windward side as we're walking along the path, clinging to life, and a beautiful, beautiful tree. I had to take a picture of it. Well, eventually we found a flat place where we could put up our camp. Again, we had been in suspense because we didn't know where we were going to find a suitable place, but this place was very inviting, and so we stopped here. Thistles, yellow flowers, the view from under the tree, across the river and the road. And these plants, I puzzled what they were for the longest time, and I finally came to the conclusion they were chives growing wild on the landscape. So here we are the next morning. The wind had blown all day. Just about bedtime, the wind quit and the midges began to swarm. Now the midges are little bitty critters. If you have a breeze more than about 5 miles an hour, they can't fly in it because they're too small and not strong enough. But the breeze dropped. They began to swarm. We took refuge in our tents. Fortunately, we had supper before they hit. Well, I had to get up in the night and answer the call of nature. I zipped open my door, stuck my head out into my tent vestibule, and immediately I was swarmed by how many hundreds or thousands of those critters. I went out, did what I had to do, came back in, dived in my tent, zipped it shut, and now they're inside with me. Well, I had a bivy bag around my sleeping bag to keep it clean, and I struggled in the dark to get the bivy bag zipped up with a face net over me, and then I started to relax. Well, at that point, the face mask seemed too warm on my face, so I said, well, I'm going to zip that off again, and I did. And for some reason, they weren't bothering me anymore. Maybe they were trying to get out through the light into the outside, hanging around on the screen. In the morning, swarmed all over us again. I sat in my tent, cooked my breakfast in the vestibule. The whole time they're swarming all over me. And they got in everything. They got in the dewdrops, the raindrops on the tent, and they drowned there. They got in my water bottle and they drowned there. They got in my oatmeal and they drowned in my oatmeal, and I ate them for breakfast, and they got all over my hands and bit me, and my hands itched for 2 or 3 days afterwards. But eventually we got packed up and headed up the road down Glenfeshie this way. Notice the ground looks pretty wet and there are clouds all over the place. At places, we were going through thick vegetation like a soppy wet tunnel. And at other places, we were walking out on the roads like this. Here is beautiful Glenfeshie and some of the forest. Trail to Kingussie. Along the way, we saw some some tame horses sheltering in the pasture, and brought to mind that the folkloric tales about the Kelpies. The Kelpies took the form of horses, but they were river spirits, and they would lurk around the fords of the rivers and offer travelers a way to get across with dry feet. So, you know, a traveler could get on the Kelpie and ride over. Well, it was a trap. The Kelpie would get you out in the middle of the river, and there it would kill you and devour you and leave your entrails strewn along the banks of the river. And some people say perhaps this is a reminiscence of the historic sacrifices to the water spirits in the olden times. And I think there's a moral or a sermon in the story. You know, if you are traveling along through life and you come to difficulties like a flooded river ford, it may be tempting to take the easy way out, but probably it is a better and safer plan just to wade right through these difficulties and deal with them as best you can. Trail to Kingussie. So we got over here at Achlean, and we had thought about camping there, but we arrived there at noon, and we wondered what we're going to do with the next 8 hours. Did we want to hang around in the rain and the midges? And then how would we get over to town, to Kingussie, in time to catch the train back to Blairauthal in the morning? And Brad looked at us and said, come hell or high water, he was going to sleep in town under a roof that night. So we all said, all right, well, we'll cross over the river and we'll head toward the town. And the topo map that I had showed a bridge. So we were going to go over here, go up through the forest, across the valley, through the forest over here, past a little town called Drumgoosh, along the road to Kingussie. That was the plan. Well, it turned out the bridge was gone. Achlean is over there. We had to cross over the river to get to this road, one of those abandoned houses. And we took one look at the river. We saw no bridge. We said, well, we're going to wade across. So we waded across. Here are Brad and Stuart. They stopped to take off their shoes to save their shoes and socks. And I heard complaints behind me about how cold the water was. I had waded across and plunged into the forest and climbed my way up the hill. And I sat here on a stump and waited for them to emerge out of that thicket and rejoin me. Here we are on the road. Notice the thick growth of bracken fern growing up waist high or more. I was reminded at this point of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel about David Balfour and Alan Breck fleeing their pursuers through the moors and hiding in the bracken. A very good story and with a lot of historical background about the Scots Highlands. Here we go through the forest, out over the plain. We stopped for lunch here. This is an old farmstead. The roof has caved in, but you can see the gable end above Stuart's head and the roof of the farmhouse over the ruins. Again, that typical farmhouse style. Here is a rowan tree, also known as a mountain ash to us. And there's the town of Kingussie across the meadows. This is the ruins of the Ruth. There's my phone. Okay, Linda's got it. This is the ruins of the Ruthven Barracks. The English conquered the Scots, and they had to put a garrison in the country to make sure they didn't rise up again and throw off the English yoke. They also You know, the Scots were an uproarious, disorderly group. They were fond of cattle rustling and banditry and other kinds of feuding, and so the garrison was in charge of trying to maintain order. Well, when Bonnie Prince Charlie decided he would try to seize the throne of the United Kingdom, he began invading the south. Eventually, he went up to Culloden. There was a decisive battle there, and the English won the battle, and the remnants of part of Bonnie Prince Charlie's army took refuge in the Ruthven barracks. When they learned that the cause was lost, they gave up. They torched the barracks, and this is all that's left of them, the stone walls. But you can see it was a very substantial establishment in its day. So here we are in the town of Kingussie at the B&B that we stayed in overnight before taking the train back to Blair Athol. It's called Sonnehalde, and it was built, we were told, by a Swiss gentleman who wanted a home here in the Cairngorms and gave it a German-Swiss name. The proprietor of the place was a guy named Bernie Jones, who fancied himself a great comedian. We asked him a little bit about his background. He said, well, he'd been married for 32 years, and they only give you 9 years for murder. Ha, ha, ha. His wife was not present. I don't know what she would have thought of that joke. This is the town common in Kingussie. Notice the Celtic cross. The Scots share this with the Irish as part of their heritage. So what does a weary backpacker long for after 9 days of trail food? Here's Margot's answer. He took a picture of his dinner, a very fine restaurant that we stayed in, and a very nice dinner to slake our appetite. So we traveled for 9 days. We hiked 138 kilometers or 85.9 miles, and we ended up back at Blair Athol, staying at the inn where we retrieved our travel luggage. The next day, we traveled by train to Glasgow, stayed in a hotel at the airport, and on the day after that, we flew back to Boston. Presented by me. Email me with your questions or to receive a written version of my narrative, which has additional information. I've enjoyed sharing this trip with you and look forward to your comments. Thank you.